Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Javier Canacue Wash Process Colombia from Say Coffee. And there's the box right there. And Say, based out of Brooklyn, New York. And I don't think it comes as a big surprise to anybody that we picked up this box of coffee, as I've been on a mission to review as many of the Chirroso and Mejorado, Típica Mejorada coffees as I can. And this is the latest Chirroso release from Say. And while I haven't necessarily been as big a fan of this variety as so many others, I do appreciate the potential that it offers, and I am going to continue to review them in the hopes that I can find one that really impresses me. This right here is day 33. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Say's recipe, which is a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Celsius. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. And with Say's recipe, they do like to go a little bit more fine than even that. Roast profile for this one, Say is notorious for roasting pretty light. This one's in line with the expectations for what you would have for one of Say's coffees. This is a very light coffee in general, may not necessarily be to the same very light standards as before, but still very light by most standards and metrics. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and I was a little taken aback by the sweetness, as there's a lot more sweets than I was initially expecting, to a point where it felt almost desserty, as there was a tropical fruit component to it, with mango coming through in mind the most. In addition to that, there was a lot of citric brightness to the cup as it does cool down, giving it some multiple layers right from the start. That definitely left a positive first impression. Day 17, ran it through the Chemex, and it was another nice day of the coffee. It is sweet with a fair bit of the floral aspects to it, a bit more vibrant in this brew method, at least in terms of the florality, as at this point I was picking up what I would describe as a honeysuckle-like aspect within this cup. Still a sugary tropicality, making for a pretty interesting coffee in general. We continue on to day 20. As I ran it through the April dripper, and the coffee came out a lot more soft in general, as a lot of the components within it were just basically a little bit more subtle. That included the florality, which within this cup had a slightly more muted brightness as well. A bit more of the tropicality was present, and at this time I would say that there was this moderate milk chocolate, something I typically like to describe as that craft chocolate bar with these lighter profiled coffees. And in addition to that, there was a softer honeysuckle aspect to it as well. So may not have necessarily been my favorite today, but we continue on to day 22 as we ran it back through the V60 with Say's recipe, and this was the best I'd experienced of this coffee to this point by a significant margin, as there was huge improvement with the tropicality in the cup, as it was the most lively it had been up to this point. In addition to that, there was slightly less of the floral aspect to it on the forefront, with a very soft orange underneath. There was plenty of brightness too, so a lot of depth in this coffee. This one felt like it had just multiple layers in general right from the start and throughout the entirety of drinking it. Day 24, back through the Chemex with Say's recipe, and it was another day of improvement. So I was trying to figure out if this was something that was a factor of letting the coffee age a little bit more, or if it was the adjustments in recipe, or if it was the brew method. But given that this was the best out experience of this coffee, I kind of came to the overall impression that it was probably the recipe, and the coffee was just improving in general, as it maintained a lot of the relatively soft characteristics with a bit more of the fruit brightness on the back end. Still the more tame milk chocolate as well as that honeysuckle-like aspect, but they are complemented well by the fruit sweetness that appears to be improving, this in a much more bright orange sense, but I'm not necessarily specifically referring to orange, but also kind of that tropical component I mentioned, sugary stone fruits, mango yet again. But another really nice day of this coffee. We continue on to day 26 as I ran it through the V60, and this is when I kind of noticed that Say's recipe really seemed to help with this one, as kind of lowering it to my standard recipe, standard temperature didn't necessarily help, as it felt slightly under-extracted due to the lightness of the cup. So I really wasn't able to pull out the same sort of vibrant components I'd experienced from the previous couple of days. Mostly tropical citrus bright with a fair bit of this kind of citrus fruit punch juice based aspect to it. I think that's kind of the best way I can describe this coffee for the duration of the time drinking it is, think of a citric based fruit punch. So not necessarily like a very red fruit punch, but one that is basically encompassed by a lot of citric components to it, some orange, some yellow flavored fruits to it, but wasn't necessarily my favorite. Rest of the cup staying soft with the chocolate and floral aspects again. Day 28, back through the Chemex and similar issues. So this is when I kind of noticed that my recipe wasn't really working well for this coffee, as I was persisting with it, and it felt slightly under-extracted yet again in terms of just lightness in the cup. It does benefit from the increase in temperature as well, and that's why I decided Say's recipe was the way I wanted to go with this one. It does remain a pretty good cup of coffee still, with the punchy characteristics yet again at the forefront, once again this kind of citric punch direction. Day 30, opted for the Chemex, and honestly I should have gone for the V60 in the final day, because looking back, the best experience of this coffee was that day 22 mark when I ran it with Say's recipe through the V60, though it was significantly better with the adjusted Say's recipe on day 30, as it was skewing in what can best be described as, yet again, the citric-based tropical fruit punch direction. And at this time, I just wanted to throw some notes so you could get a good idea of what I was experiencing. Pineapple-like aspect, orange juice, traces of papaya, passion fruit, and then the honeysuckle-like florality on the back end as well. So a lot of very strong tropical fruit components within this one, and a fair bit of brightness to match that as well. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. All right, and we have a bunch of level 4s. So we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Not really too much to say on that. I mean, that's pretty standard. Again, what you'd kind of expect for a washed Colombian coffee. And even at that end, I would say that with some of my adjustments, I was able to get a fair bit more of a defined profile to it. So I really like the cleanliness that was present within this one. Finish, level 4. Yes, it doesn't necessarily have an overbearing, long-lasting finish in any sense. It has a very kind of pretty floral finish to the cup, which follows what is a very kind of interesting tropical fruit component to it. So that finish is fun because it just kind of gives this coffee a pretty nice layering to it. Sweetness, level 4. Yes, once again, I've noticed that the handful of coffees I've reviewed from Say recently have been on the sweeter side of things, which I am really appreciating. A lot of the struggles I have with lowering roasted coffees is that they don't necessarily come out as sweet as some other coffee roasters, but this one is the sweetest churroso coffee I'd had up to this point, so I really appreciated that from this coffee. Certain days I was really blown away and impressed by the overall sweetness that was present within this one. Still reaches that level 4 mark, maybe the slightly higher side of the level 4. Acidity, level 4. Yes, I think that's kind of the expectation you would have had with this coffee. A lot of bright tropical fruit acidity present within this one. The entirety of the time drinking it, it was something that was pronounced and quite noticeable, so I don't think I have too much to say on the brightness that's within this one. Florality, level 4. That was the first really defined characteristic I had experienced from this coffee, and one that was experienced throughout the entirety of drinking it. And while it might not have been as strong and well defined as I like to describe as that butter popcorn jelly bean, it still had a kind of softness to it in general, but I was really happy with the florality that was present within this one. It was a nice little added perk and benefit to this coffee. Then we have 2 level 4s. We'll start with the berry fruit there at that level 4. And the berry fruit, I attributed that to the passion fruit, and that's something I continue to experience most specifically in a lot of Gesha coffees recently. But that's where I was kind of aligning this in terms of the berry fruits, just some tropical berries in general. So that right there at that level 4 mark. Citrus fruit, level 4. Once again, I would say the most defining citrus characteristic were 2 actually, pineapple juice and orange juice. That's why I'm kind of putting in at that citrus fruit punch melody, Then stone fruit, level 3. And while that was one of the earlier experienced fruit components within this one, the mango I had mentioned, the sugary stone fruit, wasn't quite as pronounced as some of the other characteristics towards the back end of this coffee, so that reaches that level 3 mark. And then there's actually only two other level 3s. The chocolate level 3, as mentioned, it's that kind of craft chocolate bar associated with lighter profiled coffees, so I appreciated that, a pretty chocolate in general. And then the body at a level 3, and it's interesting because this tasting wheel was made with the Chemex, so that goes to show that this coffee did have just a little bit more body and texture than you'd typically associated with that brew method, but that goes to show that maybe if I would have made it with the V60, that part might have been a little different, but I actually think that this tasting wheel would have looked, if not the exact same, then extremely similar if I would have made it with the V60, which was actually my preferred brew method for this coffee. So I actually really like the way that this tasting wheel looks. I think it's a pretty nice representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one easily is my favorite churroso coffee that I have ever had from anybody up to this point. So I'm starting to see a little bit more of what people are raving about when it comes to this variety. Even then, though, I would say that it's just on the very good end of Colombian coffees for me, because I still have a very strong preference for the Mejorado Típica Mejorada coffees, mostly because they have a bit more sweetness to them in general. This one, though, did have great sweetness, and I think that's why I was such a big fan of this one relative to a lot of the coffees that share the same variety. But in addition to that, there were some nice positives, most distinctly thinking of that florality, and it did offer some great fruit depth to it as well. So I have a lot of positive things to say about this one. This is one of those coffees where I feel like I would have been happy trying it a second time around and playing around with it a little bit more, because it just offered some great depth and complexity to it in general. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I think the direction I want to point somebody towards with this one is the tropical fruit aspects to it, because that was fun. Experiencing so many of those for the entirety of the time drinking it was something that made this a pretty fun drink in general. Obviously, you have to like your lighter profiled coffees when it comes to all of Say's coffees, so that's another thing. But aside from that, I don't think that there's too much else I would have to say about this one, so I think I will leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Javier Canacue Wash Process Colombia from Say Coffee. Thank you for watching.